Could you cut this thing for a millstone or something? He said he couldn't, so he has to play a couple stone forges, even though I'm sure he would prefer not to.
All right, Braun-Duin, is going to be on the play here, and typically a Miracles versus Stoneblade matchup tends to go in the Miracles matchup, but when you don't have that lock, how important is that counterbalance, I guess, lock in this sort of matchup?
I don't think it's very good. You can, if you have it all set up on the play, it can be powerful, but it's hard to get established. You have to play on your main phase, so Spell Pierce and Daze can be good against it, and Treasure Cruise can also overpower it, so not something I would really want for this matchup.
So in that sense, this straight blue-white control deck may be even stronger against a Stoneblade style strategy.
Especially with a main deck Supreme Verdict and the ability to find it through Dig Through Time.
Yeah, both players just trading some land drops here. Brian's fired off a couple of cantrips. First was a turn 1 Ponder, now he's going to cast a Brainstorm here, but no action yet. And the pressure is going to be on, I think, Brian at least to make the first move.
Especially if you are familiar with Andrew Cuneo's resume, you know that he is settling in for a long game.
Yeah, he's not going to be playing any win cons really at any point.
He's going to try to avoid it. We know that he has a couple Stoneforge Mystics and a Batterskull out of necessity, but
it is interesting that even if you try to get as control as possible, that a 2-mana creature ends up being the win con of choice. However, it's a third cantrip. This is going to be a cracked fetch land from Brian and then a Ponder. See, Andrew not really fighting any battles over these cantrips, just waiting to fight over the spells.
I'm sure he's looking to fight over Treasure Cruise and the threat cards. Brian can do this all that he wants. Andrew's not going to care too much about it.
Yeah, look through Brian's deck. He has 4 Young Pyromancer, 4 Stoneforge Mystic, and 2 True Name Nemesis as his threats. True Name Nemesis is an interesting one to me. Outside of the counter spells, Andrew's deck is a little soft to this card.
He does have his Sweeper, and he does have a main deck Council's Judgment, but you are correct. He is a bit soft to it.
Third land is from Andrew. That's going to be the oft-maligned Plateau, but still just 3 lands on his side. You can see a slew of blue spells over there, including Force of Will. And first play is going to be from Brian. It is a Stoneforge Mystic, quickly met by the card Counterspell from Andrew.
Andrew Cuneo posted on Twitter about a week ago. He was very excited to dust these off for the tournament, his beta Counterspells. Only ended up playing the 3 copies. He did post all 4.
And that'll go ahead and work. Stoneforge Mystic in the bin, so we still have no creatures on either side as Andrew goes to turn 4. Of note, Brian missed the 4th land drop there. Something which I'm sure Andrew will take advantage of.
Not too uncommon. I mean, even these Just Guys Stoneblade decks, they do go up pretty high on mana, but they're trying to make the land drops through cantrips, so they're pretty land light. Cuneo, I believe, playing 23 lands, which is quite a lot for a legacy deck.
Absolutely. Sam Cuneo's turn, he's going to go for a Brainstorm here.
Andrew Cuneo is a national treasure. I mean, it is hard to overstate just how awesome the deck is that he builds, how much success he has thinking completely outside the box. It's cool to watch.
It's turn 5, he goes up to a 5th land here. Brainstorms and plays a fetch land, so just continues to improve his hand. And Brian's countering with a lot of cantrips of his own, but outside that Stoneforge Mystic, Brian actually hasn't played very many threats yet.
There aren't that many threats in the deck in total. I mean, there's 4 copies of Young Pyromancer, 4 copies of Stoneforge Mystic, 2 copies of True Name Nemesis, and a Batterskull. Those are the only cards in the deck that are capable of killing Andrew. So if he's able to win the fights over the threats, Cuneo can win at his leisure.
Yeah, we'll see what Brian can, see what he can muster here. He's going to have to start trying for threats, like I said, at some point. He is building up a large graveyard, maybe toward a Treasure Cruise. That'll certainly kind of help him go toward an attrition game plan. 4 Treasure Cruises are in Brian's deck.
Cuneo playing with 2 copies of main deck Pyroblast this weekend. I'm sure Treasure Cruise on the top of the list of cards he's trying to fight.
4th land from Brian and Stoneforge Mystic. This is his 2nd try at getting a card onto the battlefield. And Cuneo has some options. He has Force of Will in his hand, Snapcaster Mage for that. Well, actually, I was going to say he could Snapcaster that counterspell, but he does not have triple blue, so that's not going to be an option, as he's going to play Force of Will on the Stoneforge Mystic. Yeah, and actually had to pitch the Snapcaster Mage due to mana consideration.
Yeah, it doesn't have the ability here to Snapcaster the counterspell, because as you mentioned, or at least it'll be problematic to do so. He plays into Spell Pierce, it's all of his mana.
Yeah, well, he has double white, and Snapcaster Counterspell would take triple blue here.
Well, he has access to the land that he just got with his Flood Strand does make blue mana.
Great.
So he has the ability to do it the next turn, not right now.
Oh, yes. Yeah, he can do it next turn. He's going to rebuild here, though. You see another Brainstorm. This is a fresh Brainstorm after that Flooded Strand was cracked.
It seems to be the big consideration is Cuneo has another copy of Snapcaster Mage. So the first one is expendable.
Sure, doesn't need two of them. Plays a 6th land and passes. His land's kind of just scattered all over the board here.
Often for players who have been playing for a very long time, and Cuneo I think goes back further than me, this is a concession to Chaos Orb. You learn to play your lands all scattered across the battlefield to prevent one color from getting orbed away.
You see, actually, Patrick Chapin does the same thing with his lands a lot of the time.
Matt Place, another example. Also, there's been some recent land versus spells debate, lands in front versus lands in back, what to do. Some people, as a response to this, like to do the grid, which is even a more extreme board where you just scatter your permanents all over the place. Cuneo kind of putting Brian in the grid a little bit right now. He doesn't have a full grid established, but he's working his way towards it. It's part of the problem with playing with permanent light strategies. It's hard to assemble a full grid.
Yeah, there's a critical mass of cards you have to have in play if you want to build a grid. At least, 9 really is the minimum,
Ideal.
I would say. Brian's going to go for a Treasure Cruise off single blue here. Gets to leap up 3 mana. Will we have a counter war over it? We will. Andrew's going to start with Pyroblast. And that'll be as far as it goes.
If Andrew's able to get more permanents in play, he can actually establish the Cali box out, which is where you use your permanents to surround your opponent's permanents, making it harder to tap them.
Okay, so then you have to go on to Brian's side of the board.
Exactly.
For this. Which, if you're wondering at home, you actually can't do. But,
but,
all right, True Name Nemesis for Brian. Andrew's going to let that one resolve. And because he has Council's Judgment in hand, it's one of the 2 answers he has in his main deck to the card, that alongside Supreme Verdict. So the board's still clear here as players will play back and forth.
And Andrew right now keeping it clean, not letting Brian establishing anything. Willing to let Brian cantrip all he wants and trying to fight over the whatever small pieces of action Brian actually has in the deck.
All right, Brian's going to have to build up toward more action. Brainstorm here, finds Force of Will, Treasure Cruise, Batter Skull. A lot of threats. Still no more lands, though. Brian is choked on lands, so he's not well equipped for a counter spell fight.
Well, there aren't that many lands in the deck, period. I mean, there's 6, 10, 14, 16, 17, 18 lands. He's not going to be able to out-mana Cuneo in most games. Cuneo has 5 more lands in the list.
See, after the Brainstorm, a Ponder here from Brian. And he's going to go ahead and shuffle. You knew 2 of those top cards, didn't like either of those. The third one was no help. So at what point, if Cuneo is going to draw these extra lands, he's going to need extra card draw here to keep pace with Brian. Walk me through his, as a good control deck has, what is his card draw?
He has a couple cantrips. We've seen Brainstorm, 4 copies of Preordain, only 1 Ponder. In terms of raw card drawing, a Fact or Fiction, a Jace the Mind Sculptor, 3 copies of Dig Through Time. So he has a lot.
5 sources of card advantage.
Yeah. And Stoneforge Mystic, if you count that, though Brian can probably fight over a lot of that stuff. I think what Cuneo's in the market for in this matchup, once he gets to this stage, is just bulk card drawing. And the Dig Through Times, the Jace, and the Fact or Fiction play that role.
All right, it's going to be another True Name Nemesis here. For Brian, it resolves. Andrew on step's going to go ahead and Dig Through Time. He exiles 5 cards, carefully leaving both Pyroblast and Council's Judgment in his graveyard for a possible Snapcaster Mage to get. Actually, the True Name is on the stack, pardon there, so we may actually fight over this card.
And Cuneo doing what he's done at this point is signaling very loudly to Brian that he has a Snapcaster Mage available.
Pyroblast cast from Brian. He wants to fight over this Dig Through Time. Snapcaster Mage back from Cuneo. It's looking to target that Pyroblast. And we have ourselves a pretty big counter war shaping up here.
Well, Cuneo may want to just go ahead and use the Snapcaster Mage here to get a Pyroblast and take care of the True Name Nemesis while it's still on the stack. He has no way to fight over the Pyroblast with what's in his graveyard, but he can make sure the True Name Nemesis does not enter play.
So right now we have a 4-card stack. True Name on the bottom, Dig Through Time above that, Pyroblast targeting Dig Through Time above that, and Snapcaster on the top of it.
Cuneo evening out his lands a little bit at this point, so he's losing some grid equity, but he is doing a very good job navigating this counter battle.
And we see here a Force of Will played by Cuneo. So we have the Snapcaster Mage resolved. He targeted Pyroblast. Now still with the stack. Now Force of Will is going to target Pyroblast. Cuneo doesn't just want to get the True Name Nemesis. He wants to get the dig as well. Of note, he actually hasn't cast the Pyroblast yet. So the Pyroblast does have flashback right now, but he could use it to maybe win a counterspell war over the dig instead if he wanted.
Yep.
And you see Cuneo, no stranger to a large counterspell fight, kind of navigating a really full stack.
Yeah.
Brainstorm was the pitch for Cuneo for his Force of Will.
And Andrew committed to trying to win this fight over dig through time.
Spell Pierce played back on Force of Will. So that's a good amount of 2-for-1 actually that Brian was able to get there. He got another Force of Will from Cuneo. So at the end of this, Brian's looks like he's going to be up cards.
Oh, for sure. Now the big question is if this True Name Nemesis resolves or not.
Yeah, the Pyroblast is targeting True Name.
So Brian has the option here. You can tell he can force. And he can say, this is the hill I'm gonna die on. I think the True Name Nemesis is good to go if it resolves. Or he can say, I'm not gonna try to fight over this fight. It looks like he's gonna try to push this True Name into play. And he's really saying, I expect True Name to be good. I don't think Cuneo can easily get off the board. He's down to 1 card in hand, and I'm willing to try to ride this to victory.
Yep, force pitching Force, and he does just that. And now True Name Nemesis versus Snapcaster Mage on the board. Just 2 lands in Cuneo's hand. He will need a copy of Supreme Verdict or Snapcaster Mage to get rid of this True Name Nemesis. He did carefully leave a copy of Council's Judgment in his graveyard.
3 Snapcasters in the deck.
And now we can see the hand is Polluted Delta and Caracas. So now Brian knows coast is clear, and imagine he will begin the race. See Brian with cards left in his hand actually winning that attrition fight against the blue-white control deck.
Well, if we're talking about raw power, Cuneo's deck has Brian's deck beat by a landslide. But if we're talking about mana efficiency, that's where Brian gets an edge. And you can see in that counter war battle that just occurred, Cuneo had a lot of cards and more mana, but Brian was just able to deploy a little bit more efficiently. And as a result of this, True Name Nemesis entered play. Now you see Brian firing off a Treasure Cruise.
Yeah, Brian taking advantage of the fact that he knows that Cuneo lost that counter war. Pyromancer into Treasure Cruise. Brian fuels up to 4 cards in hand, gets a lot of power on the board, and really starts to pull ahead. A well-placed Supreme Verdict would still be enough for Cuneo, but he's going to go ahead and need that draw.
And I believe he has found the Supreme Verdict.
Well, not too soon. Snapcaster Mage going to swing in. Brian will make that trade, and I think Supreme Verdict is going to happen anyway. So excellent draw from Cuneo is going to go ahead and keep him in the game. Now it remains to be seen what were the draws from Brian off that last Treasure Cruise.
And just keep track of the total number of threats in Brian's deck, because there are not that many.
Yep, he did draw Treasure Cruise off Treasure Cruise. So he's going to go cruising again. This time he finds the threat of Batter Skull, along with other permission, it looks like here. And Brian's just out card advantaging Cuneo really hard. Brainstorm from Andrew. He does have a fetch land up. Brian's going to let him have it. And there was that Caracas in Andrew's hand, so he will shuffle away lands if he needs to. Looks like he found
another land and a counter spell.
Yep. And Brian's going to get to know the score. Counterspell and fetch land. I'd imagine that means the other 2 cards on the top of Cuneo's deck are also lands.
Most likely.
Shuffled away by Polluted Delta.
It would have to be a really bad spell for Cuneo to want that over a land. It wouldn't surprise me if Andrew was trying to set this game up to try to deck Brian at this point.
Well, that's the issue here. Brian has resolved 3 treasure crews. Or he's tried through 3 and resolved 2. Whereas Andrew's tried for 1 dig and did not resolve it. So Brian's up a good load of cards.
And this batter skull here that you see from Brian is going to be challenging for Andrew to beat just because Brian has enough mana at this point to make it virtually indestructible if Andrew doesn't find an answer this turn.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that have to go right. Andrew needs an answer this turn. He needs Brian to not have Force plus blue card when he goes for it. And it is just, this is the draw. And it's preordained, not a bad start to trying to find that answer.
Snapcaster Mage is still good, assuming that Brian doesn't have a counterspell.
Good note for Andrew here is that he plays 4 copies of Preordain and just 1 Ponder, which is kind of a flip-flop of what you often see in Legacy, but one that I really like in his deck.
Well, he's trying to find specific cards. His deck has very polarized power level, and Preordain's a little bit better when you're trying to find specific things than Ponder is. Andrew's trying to be precise.
It's going to be a 3rd Preordain.
Andrew now shifting into a Tendrils of Agony kill this turn.
And I think at the end of all that, he found a fetch land. So 6 Scry, no answer. And now that Batter Skull is a much bigger threat. So we're not entirely sure how Andrew gets that one off the board.
Well, he has to do some weird kind of workarounds with Jace bouncing a Germ, and it's tough. He can't beat it straight up at this point. He's going to have to work around it for the rest of the game.
Yeah, well, he does have a card Counter Spell. He can counter it, make Brian pick it up, and then counter it on its way back down. But he doesn't have a card that just gets rid of Batter Skull.
Now, these control decks can work around it sometimes.
Yeah, but with that 9, Brian's going to swing for 6, bolt for 3, and Brian Braun-Duin takes game 1 from Andrew Cuneo.
And what stood out to me in that game was Brian's ability to resolve his treasure cruises and his impactful spells in general versus Andrew's inability to do the same, and that came down to mana efficiency. Spell Pierce was just better in fighting in the counter wars than the tools that Andrew brought to the table.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of situations where Andrew had to use Force of Wills. Those are cards that are really versatile, but in this kind of matchup, that 2-for-1 doesn't seem like what Andrew wants to be doing.
And it wouldn't surprise me to see those cards come out of Andrew's deck as we move to the sideboard. Andrew packing a Leyline of Sanctity, 2 copies of Terminus, a Blue Elemental Blast, a Flusterstorm, a Spell Snare, 2 Surgical Extractions, a Red Elemental Blast, a Pyroclasm, a Supreme Verdict, a Pithy Needle, a Containment Breeze, Engineered Explosives, and a Disenchant.
So just a lot of different types of removal. Going through what Jeskai does, which tools does he want here? What are the problematic permanents, I guess?
Well, I like the idea of bringing in a Disenchant, Engineered Explosives. Engineered Explosives is a pretty good sweeper against Brian's deck that's, based on cheap permanents. Disenchant can help against the equipment. I think the Red Blasts and the Blue Blasts are both good here. I like going up to a 2nd copy of Supreme Verdict, and I think the 2 copies of Terminus can come in as well, as Brian is, at his core, is a creature deck. Even though he's not that creature heavy, he still has to win through combat eventually, and 2 copies of Terminus I think can do some good work.
Now on Brian's side, he also has a lot of control style cards in the sideboard. His sideboard actually looks fairly similar to Andrew Cuneo's. He does have a copy of Vendilion Click. The interesting thing is that he probably doesn't want to morph into as much of a control deck here, mainly because he's not as well set up for it as Andrew. I imagine he'll bring in a Vendilion Click. He has other options here he has a Pyroblast of his own. Other than that, he has perhaps Meddling Mage that he could use.
I like Meddling Mage fine in this matchup. He's got to weather the storm of Andrew's removal, and there's going to be some key pieces that Andrew's trying to resolve, whether it's Supreme Verdict, whether it's Dig Through Time, Counterspell, Snapcaster Mage. I think Meddling Mage is fine here.
Yeah, at the end of the day, Meddling Mage is a threat, even though it's not a particularly good threat. The games are going long enough where the 2/2 could deal a fair amount of damage.
So we'll see. I agree with your assessment that Brian doesn't want to convert too much into a control deck, but things like Vendilion Click and Meddling Mage still allow him to apply pressure while keeping Andrew off balance, and that seems like the right mixture for the matchup. No guarantee that those cards are going to be good because Andrew has a lot of removal in his deck, but still worth at least trying.
Yeah, and You would think then that this gets better for Cuneo post board, right? We talked about a lot of cards that Cuneo can board in. He's more the control deck, and he gets to become even more controlling post board, whereas it seems like Brian doesn't have many tools to go to.
Not really, but I think the fundamentals of Brian's deck are solid in the matchup. He seems better poised to win fights over counterspell battles for the reasons we saw in game 1. His Treasure Cruise is a little bit leaner than Andrew's. Dig Through Time, it's 1 mana versus 2. And Andrew's deck just has more moving parts to it.
Yeah, and Treasure Cruise may even just be better than Dig Through Time here in a way. There's a lot of raw card going on.
Well, I think both cards are better in their respective decks. I think because Andrew's deck is all over the place, he's looking for specific tools, he has a lot of one-ofs. The selection that Dig Through Time provides is very valuable. And since Brian's deck is more about just raw rate, mana deficiency, trying to overpower with resources, Treasure Cruise is more effective for his deck. I think both decks would get worse if you swap their card drawer of choice.
Sure. And that makes a lot of sense. We did see things like last week, Rudy Brixa in the Legacy Open playing a mixture of both Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. Though at least after the event, he felt, at least in his Deathblade deck, that he would have much rather had something like Dig.
I think that 2 Dig Through Time, 1 Treasure Cruise is probably just a mistake when you see that appear in a list. They're very different cards, even though they appear similar on the surface, and your deck either just wants the most velocity, the easiest card drawer because the pieces are redundant, or you're looking for specific pieces. It's rarely both things going on.
Well, Brian is on 6 cards here. He's going to Jataxian Probe to start the game, and he's going to get to see what Cuneo's on. It is Cuneo kept a hand of 5 lands, Stoneforge Mystic, Factor Fiction.
I hope Andrew Cuneo never changes. I hope he stays like this forever.
I mean, that Stoneforge really could stand to be a counter spell.
Sure. I think I would prefer miscalculation, but sure.
Yeah, just.
But I'll take a Stoneforge Mystic. It's fine.
He might win the game too quickly with his hand, to be fair.
He does not like Stoneforge Mystic because he's not a big fan of cards that they're basically all they do is allow him to win the game. I'm sure if Brian untaps and just kills the Stoneforge Mystic, if Andrew loses the match, he's going to be very annoyed with Stoneforge Mystic being in his deck.
Right, he doesn't want any card that only wins the game. He wants them all to have other purposes and incidentally win the game.
Correct. Control 101.
Yeah.
Don't let your opponent trade resources. Try to fight over the specific threats that matter.
And there you have it. Lightning Bolt eats the Stoneforge Mystic. At least it did find the Batter Skull.
That's the thing. I'm sure Andrew's happy to play with a Batter Skull in his deck. You know, that's a fine win condition.
It's very resilient. It bounces. If you have 11 mana in play, the thing's really hard to answer.
Yeah, back in Andrew's day, he had to play with Sarah Angel, and Batter Skull has a lot of the same properties, but is slightly more powerful.
Young Pyromancer, the play here for Brian. Andrew not with an answer to that just yet. Did draw Spell Pierce for the turn to go alongside that Factor Fiction he has. And Batter Skull, but Pyromancer could do some work here. Brian.
It by itself forces a Supreme Verdict.
Yep.
As long as Brian just has random brainstorms and ponders to cast along the way.
Well, Brian's going to swing the Pyromancer for 2, but he had no land number 4. Andrew plays 4th land. Pyromancer will put Andrew down to 16. Don't know if Andrew will go for that end step Factor Fiction. I can't imagine he does, and he does not.
He's flooding out pretty badly here, and now he can set up Factor Fiction with Spell Pierce backup, which is much better, especially against an opponent who's stalling on lands.
Yeah, Brian continues to stall on lands. Now 2 versus 5. He's going to swing with Young Pyromancer. And Andrew really, you see here, using his life total as a resource.
Now, this with Brian having a little bit of a shields down moment here, this might be the spot where Andrew decides to go ahead and Factor Fiction.
Yeah, with the Brainstorm on the stack, Andrew's going to go for Factor Fiction. It'll be Factor Fiction right there, Pyroblast from Brian. Fetchland Cracking will probably be Spell Pierce back from Cuneo.
When's the last time you've seen a good Factor Fiction? I mean,
I have not. This card's great.
I haven't seen this. I mean, we occasionally see it in the SCG Open, but between 2 players at 6-0, both fantastic players, a good old-fashioned Factor Fiction split.
This isn't even playing it unfairly. You're just playing it to draw cards.
Yeah.
And
come on, Brian, let this resolve.
You know, he's got a Force of Will up to the front.
Boo! Let him have it.
He does have force and a blue card. It doesn't look like he really wants to get rid of the blue card.
If it's Treasure Cruise, then he's liable to have something like Supreme Verdict wipe his whole board and Brian have no backup.
And it will not be today that we see Fact or Fiction resolve. It is Treasure Cruise being pitched to Force of Will. So still no old school Fact or Fiction just yet.
Keep in mind, Brian also has to be able to win the fight over Batterskull, too. I mean, we forgot about that Stoneforge Mystic a couple
he can
turns
just
ago.
cast Batterskull now.
And it looks like Andrew has a land drop, so Daze will not help.
Yeah, agreed. I don't believe he's playing. He has access to Daze. Then now that Brainstorm, which is what this fight started over, is going to go ahead and resolve for Brian. So he'll get to be up to 3 cards. Managed to stop that Fact or Fiction, but he paid a pretty big price for it. He's going to go with Jataxian Probe. Batterskull preordained 2 more lands for Cuneo.
But a good chance of being able to get this Batterskull into play next turn.
Yeah, a lot of Andrew's strategy right now hinges on this Batterskull. You see 4 elemental tokens made for Brian this turn. And actually he still has 4 cards, correction, in hand, so still a lot of resources. Disenchant was the draw for Cuneo. Let's see if he can maybe find that sweeper. Starts with Preordained, bottoms both. And no sweeper, but it will be Batterskull.
Opening up with the Preordained there feels like Andrew just does not respect the possibility of Daze out of Brian's deck. Maybe it's a post-board thing because Andrew's going to be on the play, but a little bit of a risk there from Andrew because if Brian has Daze, things are disastrous for Andrew.
You're absolutely right. There's no Daze out of Brian. Doesn't look like there's removal yet for the Batterskull, but there is a Treasure Cruise. That's a 1-mana Treasure Cruise, making a 5th elemental token. If Brian can find any answer here for this germ, this will be difficult if Brian can find an answer for the germ, this will be very difficult for Andrew. See both a second Young Pyromancer and a Force of Will drawn there for Brian. Yeah, if he doesn't answer this germ token, it actually will stabilize against this board.
Oh, easily. And Andrew's reaching the amount of mana needed to start doing the dance.
Well, see the draw for the turn, a pretty spicy one. It's a copy of Pyroclasm.
All right, let's test the waters with this.
Brian will have to counter this, I would think, if he can. I mean, he can let it resolve, but it's not good for him. You think he might just let it go?
Well, this is a tough place to fight a fight because you know that Andrew's got more powerful stuff in his deck. Also, your tokens aren't even worth very much right now because of the Batterskull.
He's going to Force of Will, pitching Meddling Mage. Doesn't feel like he can rebuild from that spot. And that's a good 2-for-1 scored for Andrew. Kind of undoes some of the work that Treasure Cruise did on Brian's side.
Brian down to 2 copies left in his deck. Remember, 1 got cast, 1 got pitched to Force of Will, so.
And still 3 copies of Dig left in Cuneo's deck, and a Jace. So Cuneo up 4-2 on card draw spells.
And this is a great play here from Andrew. Subtle thing. Had the option to preordain right now. Elects not to. Why? He doesn't know what he's looking for. He's happy to have this board just develop as it is right now. And he wants more information down the line in case Brian does something dramatic. So there's no reason to cast a selection spell in a spot where you don't even know what you're looking for yet.
Yeah. Brian has not presented a threat that Andrew feels the need to answer right now. So he's not going to go looking for a card. Stoneforge Mystic cast on Brian's side. And in response to that, Andrew's going to Swords the Young Pyromancer.
This means that Andrew's intending on fighting some sort of counterspell fight over the Stoneforge Mystic.
Okay, and then he spell snares the Stoneforge. Well, if the Young Pyromancer wasn't a threat before, why would it be now? You know, why did he change his mind on it?
Well, I just don't. There is some risk of something happening to the Batterskull. So you don't want the board to get too developed, and then suddenly Brian finds a Wear Tear or something that kills a germ, and you take 1,000,000 points of damage.
All right.
Andrew wouldn't mind controlling the board a little bit. He doesn't want to expend a lot of resources, but trading 1 for 1 seems fine.
Go ahead and swing with the germ here. Ponder kept the 3 cards on top. Remember, Andrew does have an uncracked fetch land, so it's not certain that he will keep all 3 of them. He'll draw as many of them as he liked. A swing by the Germ token, and everybody's going to get in front of it. Looks like Andrew will just be okay taking down 4.
And because Brian's not really doing anything, as we mentioned, the board was just sort of not being developed on either side. I think Andrew's fine playing a game with Batterskull where he just returns to his hand, recast, and just tries to wear Brian out of resources.
Yeah, he is going to have to fight a counter war on that recast. Maybe Brian will be able to win it.
Perhaps, but again, it's just about draining Brian out of total resources.
Right, and these 2-for-1s that he's getting, when these counter spell fights have happened, Brian's been able to win almost all the counter wars. However, he's had to 2-for-1 himself at each point.
Yeah.
Jace tried for by Cuneo. It gets hit by Pyroblast. And now he'll pass back. Brian now has damage. He has 2 unanswered elemental tokens. Andrew does have 17 life, so he can take damage for a while, but Brian's back on the board.
And Andrew in a position to start doing some Batterskull shenanigans.
Here's Treasure Cruise number 3 from Brian Braun-Duin.
And it is really hard to win a game through 1-on-1 exchanges when your opponent is casting Ancestral Recall every 3rd turn.
And this is the hard part. It's not that Cuneo doesn't have his own Delve card jars. He just doesn't seem to resolve them as often as Brian gets to resolve his.
Well, he's a little less efficient at fighting the counterspell fights over them. And the first Dig Through Time / Treasure Cruise will lead to future Dig Through Times and Treasure Cruises. So the first one to get resolved is a huge edge, both for the obvious reasons and the long-term implications that other card drawers will resolve as a result.
You see that end step fetch there from Andrew. He's going to go ahead and make that play. He knew the top of his deck and was not happy about it. And he's going to use all 8 of his mana to bounce and recast Batterskull. That will get spell pierced by Brian. And Andrew now just with a lonely disenchant, having lost his Batterskull.
A lot of big draws left in his deck. And Brian without that much pressure.
So the question is, how does Andrew win at this point? He's lost his Jace, he's lost his Batterskull.
I mean, Brian can still get decked.
Right, but what if Andrew draws too many cards? I mean, he has to watch out for that, right?
Yeah, but Brian's already cast a number of Ponders, Brainstorms, 2 copies of Treasure Cruise. Feels unlikely that Andrew would be the one to get decked. But he is light on ways to win the game at this point. He's down to a Stoneforge Mystic that has no copies of equipment to find. He has his 3 Snapcaster Mages.
So it's just 1 Batterskull in the deck, no second piece of equipment.
Correct. This deck has very few creatures, so Jitte does not make much sense.
Yeah, swing for 2 there from Brian. Copy of Counter Spell drawn by Cuneo. Vendilion Click, that'll eat the counter spell. So it'll still just be 2 a turn from Brian. And Flusterstorm and Force of Will both in Brian's hand. Seems unlikely that Andrew will be able to really answer these creatures before he takes 6 turns worth of damage.
He does have his Supreme Verdict, but Brian doesn't have to add anything else to this board. He can use his counter spells to fight over whatever big draws Andrew has left.
Yeah, and he has a replacement Young Pyromancer if Andrew does manage to get a Supreme Verdict through. So in that sense, Andrew is in a rough spot. Checks his graveyard. His graveyard interaction cards are Snapcaster Mage and Dig Through Time. He'll go with Dig Through Time.
With a ton of stuff in the graveyard here, so this is pretty easy.
We'll see if it resolves. My guess is it will not. Andrew still gets the 2-for-1 he was looking for. This is Forcible pitching Flusterstorm.
But the 2-for-1s are not that great when your opponent is ahead 6 cards off of Treasure Cruises alone.
Right. And Andrew down to 7 from these elemental tokens. You're right, Stoneforge Mystic not even that bad of a draw right now because it's a 1/2, amusingly enough.
It's a good blocker.
Yeah, it forces Brian to play more creatures. Like this True Name Nemesis, though. That's going to be a pretty good one. Card draw from Cuneo. Does it help? No, it does not. Passes back. It's going to get dropped to 2 this turn.
And now this is Supreme Verdict or Bust. And keep in mind, Brian still has lightning bolts left in the deck. We saw one early on in the game, so even if Cuneo does draw a sweeper, it may not be enough.
And looks like a Hydro Blast on top here for Brian. May keep that. Also an additional copy of Ponder. And yeah, looking at his hand, it's pretty stacked here. 5 power worth of creatures, and Brian's gonna go for Lightning Bolt. That will do it. 2-0. Brian Braun-Duin moves to 7-0, secures his spot in day 2.
And what stood out to me in those games, you know, they're both playing lands and cantripping to kind of improve their hands incrementally. And eventually there's a fight over something. Probably going to be Treasure Cruise or Dig Through Time from one of the decks. But whatever it is, at that point you just get to see who has the better hand, who's better equipped to win a counterspell fight. And Brian's list felt a lot more mana efficient in those kind of fights than Andrew's did. Counterspell, solid magic card. In Legacy, if the game goes on long, of course it's going to be a great catch-all. But when it's time to fight counterspell fights, you want Spell Pierces, you want Pyroblasts, and Brian brought a lot more to that to the table. And once he was able to get that first Treasure Cruise to stick, he was able to keep Andrew off of resolving anything of note.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, so